When you hear the words Wild West, what comes to mind? A lone rider under a crimson sunset, dust kicking up behind a galloping horse, saloon doors swinging as a stranger walks in, revolver at his side. Gunslingers, outlaws, frontiersmen, all part of a romantic image burned into the American imagination. But what if we told you that behind all that grit and glory was an overwhelming stench? Because here's what the movies leave out. The Old West stank. Not just a little. Not just after a day's work. We're talking about months without bathing, shared towels, communal toothbrushes, and outhouses filled with black widow spiders. Hygiene in the Old West wasn't just bad. It was primitive. And in some cases, deadly. People didn't understand germs. They didn't have plumbing. They didn't even have consistent access to clean water. Disease ran rampant. Personal space was a luxury. And soap? That was a harsh mix of animal fat and lye that often hurt more than it helped. Still, people survived. They adapted. They got creative. But in the process, they also created some of the most revolting hygiene habits in history. And one of those habits, one simple, overlooked detail, is so shocking, you might never see cowboy movies the same way again. Let's dive into the dirty truth behind hygiene in the Old West and uncover what they really lived and smelled like. Bathing was a luxury and sometimes a myth. In the American Old West, bathing was not something people did every day. For most, it wasn't even something they did every week. Clean water was difficult to find. Many settlers lived far from rivers or springs. In some places, even rainwater was collected and saved for drinking, not for washing. When people did bathe, it was usually inside a wooden tub. The whole family shared it. The father went first, then the mother, then the children. By the end, the water was dark, greasy, and full of dirt. Soap didn't help much. Most soap was made at home, using animal fat, ashes, and lye. It was strong and smelled bad. Sometimes it even burned the skin. In the Southwest, some families used natural soap made from yucca plants. It worked better, but it wasn't common everywhere. During the cold months, bathing became almost impossible. Rivers froze. The air was icy. A cold bath could cause illness, or worse, death. So people simply stopped bathing during winter. Most settlers only washed their face, hands, and maybe feet. They wiped off sweat with a cloth or rinsed with a small cup of water, when available. Smell was part of daily life. Everyone around you had the same problem. People wore the same clothes for days or weeks. Laundry was rare. Nobody expected you to be clean. Men who worked with cattle, wagons, or in mines often went for months without a full wash. Some tried to hide the smell with herbs or tobacco. Others didn't care. In towns, bathhouses did exist, but they cost money. Not everyone could afford them. Toilets were pits of horror. Toilets in the Old West were nothing like the bathrooms we know today. There were no sinks, no pipes, no flushes, and definitely no privacy. Most homes, cabins, and camps had what people called an outhouse. It was a small wooden shack built over a deep hole in the ground. You walked outside to use it, even in the middle of the night or during a snowstorm. Inside the outhouse, there was no light and no ventilation. Just a wooden seat with a hole, and everything that went into that hole stayed there for weeks or months. The smell was overwhelming. Many people tried to cover it with ashes, lime, or even dried grass, but it never worked for long. There were other problems too. Insects and animals lived inside outhouses. Flies swarmed everywhere. Spiders crawled across the walls, and in the American South and West, black widow spiders were a serious threat. They liked to hide under the seat. A bite from one could send a person into shock, or worse. Toilet paper didn't exist. People used whatever they could find. Corn cobs were common, so were leaves, rags, and sometimes even newspaper, if they had any. These materials weren't soft, they weren't clean, and they often caused infections or skin irritation. In many towns and frontier camps, there weren't even outhouses. People relieved themselves behind buildings, near trees, or along rivers. That waste often washed into local water sources when it rained, causing serious health problems. Diseases like cholera and dysentery spread quickly in places where hundreds of people drank from the same stream. In some areas, communities built public outhouses. But again, these were shared by dozens of families. No one cleaned them regularly. Some had floors made of wood, and if the boards broke, people could fall into the pit below. For many settlers, using the toilet wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. And every trip to the outhouse reminded them just how harsh and risky life in the West really was. Sharing towels, sharing germs. In the Old West, people didn't just share stories and whiskey, they also shared germs. Hygiene supplies were limited. Personal items like towels, cups, and even toothbrushes were sometimes used by dozens of people, especially in public places like saloons, bunkhouses, and military camps. Let's start with towels. In most saloons, there was a towel hanging near the bar or on the wall. It wasn't there for decoration, it was there for everyone to use. After drinking beer or chewing tobacco, customers wiped their mouths on it. Then the next man did the same. And the next, all night long. That towel wasn't washed between uses. It stayed there until it was too dirty to touch. By then, it had already spread germs between dozens of people. Diseases like tuberculosis, influenza, and strep throat were common in frontier towns. Most people didn't understand how germs spread. They didn't think twice about sharing a towel, a spoon, or a shaving blade, and that lack of knowledge made things worse. Spitting was another big problem. Men chewed tobacco constantly, especially in saloons and gambling halls. Spittoons, metal containers used for spit, were placed on the floor. But not everyone used them. Many simply spat on the floor. To hide the mess, saloons spread sawdust across the floor. It soaked up spit, beer, and everything else. But it also trapped bacteria, turning the floor into a breeding ground for disease. In crowded sleeping quarters, like bunkhouses or hotels, people shared beds, blankets, and air. One person got sick, everyone around them followed. There were no antibiotics, no hand sanitizer, no understanding of viruses or bacteria. If someone coughed on you and you got sick, it was seen as bad luck, not a hygiene issue. The truth is, the West didn't just spread opportunity, it also spread illness. And for many settlers, their downfall wasn't a bullet or a brawl. It was a towel, wet, dirty, and shared by far too many. Bugs were a daily nightmare. In the Old West, one of the most constant and unavoidable problems was insects. Bugs were everywhere. Inside homes, wagons, beds, clothing, and even food. People didn't have screens on windows, sealed doors, or insect repellents. Once bugs got in, they stayed. Lice were especially common. People called them seam squirrels, a nickname that might sound funny until you realize what it meant. These tiny parasites lived in the seams of clothes and bedding. They bit constantly, causing itching, rashes, and even skin infections. Because laundry was rare and showers were even rarer, lice spread quickly. Everyone had them, children, adults, men, and women. You could burn your clothes, but that meant losing the only set you owned. Then there were bedbugs. They lived inside mattresses, wooden bed frames, and wagon bedding. At night, they came out to feed. People woke up with red, swollen bites and bloodstains on their sheets. Mosquitoes were another problem, especially near rivers, lakes, and marshes. They didn't just bite, they carried diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Some towns lost dozens of people every summer to mosquito-borne illnesses. Flies were everywhere too. They landed on food, on people, on feces. They carried germs from place to place and were nearly impossible to control. In warm months, entire towns buzzed with them. Settlers tried hanging strips of sticky paper from ceilings or placing herbs near windows, but it didn't stop the swarm. Fleas, ticks, and mites also lived on people and animals. If you owned a dog, a horse, or cattle, you were never free from crawling pests. And if you slept near hay or livestock, you woke up scratching. People in the Old West didn't talk much about bugs. They accepted them. Like dirt, like dust, like bad teeth. They were part of life. But that didn't make it easier. Settlers didn't fear bugs because they were gross. They feared them because they couldn't be stopped. And every bite, every itch, was a reminder. Out here, even the smallest things could make you suffer. Women tried, men didn't. In the Old West, there was a clear difference in how men and women handled personal hygiene. Women tried, men usually didn't. Even in harsh conditions, women made efforts to stay clean. Every morning, many would go to a nearby stream or spring to wash their face and hands. Some carried cloths to wipe off sweat and dust during the day. They braided their hair to keep it neat. They used herbs, ashes, and homemade rinses to wash when possible. Privacy was limited. Most women couldn't bathe in public or even in shared homes, but that didn't stop them from trying. Even a small cloth dipped in water was better than nothing. They also cared more about clothing. Dresses and undergarments were washed more often, especially if the family had access to water. Women repaired and reused clothing to keep it functional and clean. Men, on the other hand, had different priorities. Cowboys, miners, and soldiers often went weeks or months without bathing. Many owned just one set of clothes. They wore it day and night, through sweat, rain, dust, and blood. Bathing was seen as unnecessary, or even dangerous. Some believed that washing too often made you sick. Others just didn't care. Working men spent long days on horseback, moving cattle, hauling wagons, or digging in mines. At the end of the day, they were exhausted. Cleaning up wasn't on their list. Some men smoked tobacco or chewed herbs to hide the smell of their breath. Others rubbed grease or oil into their hair to keep it from matting. But that wasn't about hygiene. It was about appearance. In general, women felt more social pressure to stay clean and presentable. They lived under stricter expectations, even in the middle of nowhere. Men were judged more by strength and skill than smell. Still, both men and women faced the same limits. No plumbing, little privacy, and almost no access to clean water or proper soap. But the effort mattered. In a world covered in dust and disease, a little bit of care could go a long way. The one detail that'll haunt you. Out of all the disturbing hygiene habits in the Old West, one detail stands out more than any other. And it's not about toilets, not about lice, not even about shared towels. It's about the toothbrush, or more accurately, the lack of them. Toothbrushes weren't common in the 1800s, especially on the frontier. Many families didn't have one at all. Toothpaste, as we know it, didn't exist. Some people used baking soda. Others used salt or ash. But in many cases, they didn't brush at all. Now, here's the part that will stay with you. In crowded spaces like bunkhouses, saloons, and army barracks, a single toothbrush was sometimes shared by multiple men. One brush, no soap, no rinse, just passed from mouth to mouth. Sometimes it hung on a hook near the water bucket. Sometimes it sat in a cup. If you wanted to clean your teeth, or at least scrape something off, you used what was available. No one knew about bacteria. No one thought twice about the risk. But the result was deadly. Diseases like tuberculosis, gum infections, mouth sores, and even syphilis spread through shared items. Cuts and blisters in the mouth made things worse. People who already had poor nutrition or vitamin deficiency were more vulnerable, and oral hygiene was not a priority. People had rotting teeth, swollen gums, and constant mouth pain. The solution? Pull it out. Many had their teeth yanked by barbers or blacksmiths without any painkillers. A shot of whiskey was all you got. In time, a missing tooth was just part of the look. Yellow teeth, bleeding gums, and terrible breath were so common, people barely noticed. But the shared toothbrush? That was something worse. It wasn't just unsanitary, it was personal, intimate, and dangerous. And knowing that a man might have chewed tobacco, spit into the dirt, then picked up the same brush you used yesterday. That's the kind of detail that stays with you, long after the dust settles. Closing. We romanticize a rotten reality. When we think about the Old West, we picture freedom. Open skies, rugged landscapes, brave men and women chasing a new life. We remember the cowboy hats, the gun duels, the campfires, but we rarely remember the smell, or the sickness, or the slow daily erosion of comfort, health, and dignity. Because the truth is, the American frontier wasn't just hard, it was filthy. No plumbing, no medicine, no understanding of germs. The people who lived through it weren't just tough, they were constantly at risk. From infection, from disease, from their own environment. We often celebrate their courage, and we should. But we also need to see the full picture. Most people lived in dirt-covered clothes. They went months without proper baths. They shared towels, tools, razors, and sometimes even a toothbrush. Bedbugs and lice were part of everyday life, and something as simple as a splinter or a rash could turn deadly. The West wasn't clean, it wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't the Hollywood version. But still, people pressed forward. They built towns, started families, took risks, and in doing so, they built a country. That's what makes the contrast so powerful. Behind every story of bravery was a daily battle against filth. Behind every big dream was a small, dirty reality. So next time you see a cowboy ride off into the sunset, remember, he probably hadn't bathed in weeks. His shirt was covered in sweat and dust, and he might have just used a public towel shared by half the town. The Old West was real. It was raw. And sometimes, it was disgusting. But that's what makes it human. That's what makes it worth telling, truthfully. The Old West wasn't just built on grit and guns. It was shaped by daily struggle, discomfort, and a constant battle to stay alive. Hygiene was one of the hardest fights, and one most people never talk about. But now you know. If this glimpse into the untold side of frontier life opened your eyes, there's more to discover. Because the truth behind the legends is always messier and far more human than we imagine. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and join us as we uncover the forgotten realities of the past. From dirty water to deadly duels. History isn't just about what happened, it's about how people lived through it.